Thank you very much, Mr. President, for very kind and warm introductions, as well as putting a lot of pressures on me. But I suppose it is good for digestions after a hearty meal. So His Excellency President Grimson, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. So it is both my privilege and pleasure to be here in Iceland to attend the inaugural Arctic Circle Forum. So I would like to firstly take this opportunity to thank President Grimson and his government for inviting the Singapore to this event. This forum has garnered a lot of attention since it was first proposed early in the year. So as an inclusive arena for all interested countries and participants and organizations to discuss Arctic development and also opportunities. So the forum has attracted many high-level representations from different backgrounds, interests, and ideas. This shows that the Arctic is an increasingly important region, not just for the Arctic states, but also for the rest of the world. So in the face of a changing environment, we know that the sustainable development in the Arctic is of utmost importance. And Singapore, being a very small, low-lying island state that is relying on seaborne trade, can be greatly influenced and impacted by what happens in the Arctic region. And this is why we are here. And Singapore's Arctic engagement started in 2009, following a visit into a study into the implications of Arctic developments on Singapore. So this study has resulted in a series of visits and also discussions with experts in the field, which helped Singapore identify the concerns and challenges facing the Arctic region, the environment, and also its indigenous communities. This is why we applied to be an observer in the Arctic Council. And this is also the reason why we are participating in this inaugural Arctic Circle Forum. As the newest kid on the block, so we hope to be able to continue the learning journey from our friends from all over the world. So Singapore aims to contribute positively and also meaningfully to the work that has been done in the Arctic region. So we will look forward towards leveraging Singapore's experience to dovetail the priorities of what has been undertaken on the Arctic region. Here we have identified 4 areas that Singapore intends to focus on as our contribution to the Arctic region. First is the environment. Climate change and evidence of global warming are undeniable. We have seen and read and heard from the previous presentations from the speakers. So the melting of the Arctic sea ice is becoming more and more rapid. So recent predictions forecast a rise of anywhere from 1 meter to 7 meters in sea levels by the year 2100. If we were to start calculating from this year, it is just a mere 87 years away. So there are many different predictions on the rising of the sea levels, but all point to the same conclusion that if we continue with the current amounts of carbon emissions, the resultant effects will be devastating to mankind as well as the animals and the plant worlds. This is of particular concern to Singapore because the highest elevation of our low-lying island is the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, and it is only 163 meters above sea level. So geographical distance is not a factor when it comes to the global effects on climate change. So the melting of the Arctic sea ice can pose a threat to our survival. So in other words, what happens in the high north can have implications and serious consequences for countries much nearer to the equator. This is why we are so serious about doing our part to address the climate change. And Singapore has consistently strive to be energy efficient. So our CO2 emissions per dollar GDP are among the lowest internationally, based on the data published by the International Energy Agency. And the Asian Green City Index, developed by Economist Intelligence Unit, also ranks Singapore as Asia's greenest metropolis. So although Singapore makes up less than 0.2% of the global emissions, we are committed to play our part in the global fight against climate change. So Singapore has made an unconditional pledge to reduce our emissions by 7 to 11% below business as usual level by the year 2020. And we are also studying now intensively on how we can stabilize emissions beyond 2020 while continuing our economic growth. So climate change requires a global solution with every country playing its part to reduce emissions. It is therefore important to provide support to build capacity in developing countries to those that need it. So Singapore is committed to sharing experiences and know-how with other developing countries. Singapore has also taken other steps in protecting the Arctic environment. So we are aware that Arctic migratory birds stop by our Sungai Buloh Wetlands Reserve and our southern islands during the winter season in the Arctic. So our national park boards and also agri-food and veterinary authorities are working with the Arctic and other partners to attract Arctic migratory birds along the East Asian, Australasian flyway. And the tracking or the bird census is done on a monthly basis. So any change in the migratory birds' patterns and the profile will be detected very early. And then early warnings will be sent out, and appropriate actions and timely action can be taken. So in that respect, Singapore actually can be the Arctic's thermometer in the equator area, where we can help to monitor and check what's happening on the migratory birds as a result of changes in the Arctic region. So the second focus of Singapore is about safe Arctic region. It is equally important to open up the Arctic region through safe and responsible shipping. So we believe that this can be achieved through an international rules-based framework for Arctic shipping that is based on the United Nations Conventions on the Laws of the Sea. And Singapore is therefore working with the Arctic states and other maritime partners through the International Maritime Organization to develop a polar code. This will regulate the safety of ships operating in polar waters. Singapore is situated along one of the most important and busiest sea lines of communication, the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. About 120,000 vessels call at our port each year. So at every given hour, there are more than 300 ships passing through, calling on the Singapore port. So we are therefore very conscious of the importance of working with our neighbors and the international maritime community to ensure the safety of navigation and also the protection of the marine environment in our region. So besides international cooperation, there is also a need for adequate and reliable infrastructure to deliver swift and effective emergency response to maritime emergencies in the Arctic. So the Arctic region is a fragile environment, as pointed by many previous speakers, with harsh climatic conditions. So quick and effective responses will be necessary to minimize any environmental damage. Likewise, there's also a need to have in place a swift search and rescue operation and system to minimize the loss of lives. So on this front, I know with sadness the tragic loss of lives of the 3 men who died in a helicopter crash in the Northwest Passage just last month. So Singapore stands ready to cooperate with the Arctic states and share our experiences and know-how on emergency response plans. The third area of concern that we have is on sustainable economic development. Economic development in the Arctic is no less important. The Arctic is a resource-rich region. The United States Geological Survey estimates that 22% of the world's oil and natural gas could be located beneath the Arctic. And recently, the UK exploration company stumbled upon a reservoir off the far north of Norway, which could contain up to 160 million barrels of oil. There are also large gold, iron, and zinc mines with a large amount of fish. And Arctic fisheries also supplies the world with large amount of fish. And some of them eventually land up on the dinner table in the families in Singapore. And in Singapore, we are food people. We all not only put fish and other things on the table, we also put fish on our tie or our clothing, like this one. It has got the sockeye salmons from Alaska. That's how we treasure the natural endowments, and that's why we want to do our best to preserve all this fragile ecosystem. Singapore has no interest. I want to stress this. Singapore has no interest, nor do we have the resource or capability for natural resources exploration and extraction. However, we do have the technical know-how and the knowledge in developing tools for the Arctic. Singapore was the first Asian country to construct icebreakers. Wonder a country just 1 degree north of equator actually is quite interested in developing icebreakers. A Singapore company called Keppel Corp is one of the world's leaders in offshore rig construction and has completed ice-class rigs for Arctic oil and gas industry. Keppel is now looking into the construction of a new environmentally friendly green rig. And this way, we hope to be able to contribute to the sustainable economic development of the Arctic without causing environmental damage and the implications. Arctic research is also an important component of Singapore's Arctic interests. Our National University of Singapore Center for Offshore Research and Engineering, as well as the Singapore Maritime Institute, have conducted research on the Arctic. It is therefore imperative that we gain a deeper understanding, which will help us adapt to the changing environment and also contribute to the ongoing research already taking place on the region. The fourth and the last area that Singapore is interested to focus on is the human capital. During our visits to the various Arctic regions such as Iqaluit, Niue, and Rovaniemi, we learned about the key roles indigenous peoples play in the development of the Arctic region. While it is easy for outsiders to see the Arctic as a mere barren, icy place with polar bears, the Arctic actually is very rich and a diverse region full of tradition, culture, heritage, and life. However, the rapidly changing face of the Arctic has also brought inevitable changes to the lifestyles of these indigenous communities. So Singapore was once a developing country without resources, struggling to survive. At that time, few people believed we could make it, but we did. So our founding fathers had the foresight to focus on developing the human capital, which is the only resource that we have in Singapore. So we train, we educate, and we guide our people so that our country could develop economically, raise our productivity, and also result in many innovations. We believe that the development of human capital is also important for the Arctic to ensure that the indigenous communities can continue their lifestyle and also adapt to these changes that have been thrust upon them. So in this regard, Singapore took a first step by organizing a study visit for some members of the different Arctic indigenous communities in June last year. So these representatives came to Singapore for a one-week-long visit, and they were shown the Singapore story, from urban planning to port management to water recycling. And the feedback we received was very positive, and we intend to organize a second visit for the indigenous communities to Singapore in the near future. To further build on this initiative, so we welcome the opportunity to partner other interested Arctic countries and organizations through our third country training program for the Arctic indigenous communities. Singapore also recognizes the importance of preserving the local knowledge and the heritage of the Arctic communities. Traditions do not mean outdated or obsolete. In fact, tradition partners well with modernism. So one example of this is demonstrated through a Singaporean company called Thornton Media. Founded by a Cherokee and a Singaporean couple, Thornton Media has developed Apple and Android indigenous language applications. Thus far, they have covered a wide range of American indigenous languages. It's so diverse and wide and so esoteric that I would not be able to repeat or pronounce those names, but they have actually created applications to cover a wide range of American indigenous languages in the application. So these applications preserve indigenous languages that are quickly diminishing as fewer and fewer people speak them over time. So what the Thorntons are doing is marrying tradition and heritage with modern-day technology. While seeking to contribute to developing the human capital in the Arctic, Singapore is also raising awareness amongst a cross-section of our population to the Arctic. In other words, we want to bring Arctic closer to Singapore, closer to equator. So the Frozen Tundra exhibition organized at the Singapore's Zoological Gardens featured Inuka, a polar bear that was born in Singapore. And this exhibition also offers a glimpse of the Arctic to our population, particularly the young people, because we hope that the younger generation of Singaporeans will take an active interest in the Arctic region. And then when they grow up, and then they will be able to look for opportunities to get involved in projects up north here, so as to play our part to contribute to the conservation of the Arctic region. So in August this year, we also partnered the Canadian High Commission in Singapore to co-host a photo exhibition called the Accessible Arctic. So this exhibition featuring 36 Arctic photographs taken from Canadian Geographic. There are also several Singaporean artists who have spent time in the Arctic region in the last few years. So they had organized an exhibition showcasing their works, paintings to the public. And we have plans to organize more exhibitions to showcase all these art pieces in future, to bring Arctic even closer to Singapore. So Singapore is acutely aware that developments in the Arctic will not only just affect the Arctic states, it also affects Singapore, a tropical country over 7,200 kilometers away from the Arctic region, and the wider community of the states in the tropical arena. So Singapore does look forward to working with the Arctic states, concerned parties and organizations to ensure the sustainable development of the Arctic region for our mutual benefits and common interests. So this Arctic Circle Forum is a premier assembly for engaging countries, companies, organizations, and individuals interested in the Arctic. So more importantly, it also allows us to discuss the appropriate actions, course of actions necessary to address the Arctic issues. So I look forward to a very fruitful, open dialogue with all of you here. And I wish the Arctic Circle Forum every success in the years to come. So lastly, I just want to mention that the last slide that you saw on the screen They were actually Arctic migratory birds who flew all the way from the Arctic regions to Singapore to send us their friendship. So on this note, I will also want to extend Singapore's friendship to all of you. Let's work together for the common interests of Arctic region. Thank you.
There are microphones here in the hall, and please let's wait for the questions, otherwise the people behind will think that there's no need for questions in the other session. So, and introduce yourself before you ask the question. Yeah, take one here, and then we will take one there. Yeah. Please.
I'm Jim Gamble. I'm Executive Director of Valued International Association. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I have a little knowledge of Singapore because our agency was one of the agencies invited on the fact-finding tour to Singapore, and we were very grateful to get to know Singapore better. And one of the things I learned during this fact-finding tour is that, in my mind, one of Singapore's strengths is in infrastructure development. And as we all know, the lack of infrastructure in the Arctic is a factor that exacerbates many of the climate change effects, many of the human safety issues, many of the difficulties of the changing Arctic. So it leads me to believe that Singapore might have answers for that. And I'm wondering if you foresee a time when Singapore might be involved in infrastructure development in the Arctic.
We will take the second question and then answer. If you could please introduce yourself and put the question.
Thank you. My name is Art Nash, and I'm with Cooperative Extension in Alaska. My question is this: with several Asian nations who are not polar nations being interested in being a part of the whole polar process and the transportation routes and the exploration, to what degree do you see pre-existing treaties, relationships, maybe even tenuous arguments that have gone in the past amongst the other Asian nations, as well as Singapore, that are also vying for a seat at the table, so to speak? To what degree your relationship with China, with Japan, Korea, and the others who want to come on up, so to speak, could you see those relationships maybe affecting the current attempts at amongst the polar nations at coming up with agreeable rules of the road, so to speak, for the positive or for the negative?
Okay, so we will take answers to these two questions before we take the next questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Infrastructural development. Well, Singapore is a very small country. So we also have a very short history. We're just less than 50 years of independence. So we do not really claim to have all the answers to every development aspects of a nation building. So if you would ask me, I would say that Singapore's strength lies not so much on the infrastructural development. We learn a lot of infrastructural planning and all that from many other countries. But I would like to think that in Singapore, our strength actually lies more with the software. Because it is always easier to build hardware. If you get the right architect, right planners and all that, you can actually map out a very wonderful master planning for infrastructural developments. But it is more challenging and difficult to come out with strategies to articulate all these infrastructural developments with the human capital development, and then put in place a system where we can put the best man in the best place to run all these infrastructural systems. So this is why in Singapore, during my presentation, in Singapore, we would like to offer our experiences in software development, human capital development, so that we can help and share our know-how and experiences with the indigenous communities, and also with the companies, with the countries which are getting involved in the Arctic developments to also do some CSR projects. When I say CSR, it is not corporate social responsibility, but it's country social responsibility. So that together we will be able to make sure that Arctic is a place that can be developed on a sustainable basis. And then to the second question you asked about other Asian countries' involvement in the Arctic development. I'm sure there are also representatives from all these countries. We heard the presentation from China. We're going to hear a presentation from Korea. Maybe it's also useful after listening to their presentations, then you will be able to draw conclusions on how these countries can contribute to the Arctic regions. But for Singapore, we will be happy to work with any countries in terms of the third country training program, where we can offer something together with the concerned countries or even organizations to do something to protect the environment in the Arctic regions, to enhance the capabilities of the indigenous people, and also to preserve the flora and the fauna in the Arctic region, so that generations in the future will be able to see the birds flying southward, to taste the sweetness of the salmon, and also to see polar bears in a tropical country like in Singapore.
We have a few minutes more, so if we can take one question here and one question there, but try to put the questions very briefly.
There are still many, Charles Ebinger from Brookings in Washington. There are still many people.
Can you introduce yourself for the purpose of the audience, please?
Yeah, Charlie Ebinger. I'm the director of the Energy Security Initiative at Brookings in Washington. There are still many countries in the world, besides those that have either obtained or are trying to obtain observer status in the Arctic Council, who argue that the unique nature of the Arctic really falls under the broader UN doctrine of the common heritage of mankind, and that perhaps we should get the muscle behind the literal states to really realize this and lead a charge to involve many more nations in debating the future of the Arctic, since you make a compelling case how Singapore might be affected, but obviously many other nations could be affected by dramatic sea level rise. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, and briefly, that question there. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Rasmus Bertelsen from Aalborg University, Denmark. Two brief questions. You emphasize the importance of human capital. In Europe and the US, I've had very talented Singaporean colleagues who returned to Singapore, contributed to Singapore. What are the lessons from Singapore on brain circulation, which I think will be crucial to Arctic development? And the other question is more political. What is the thinking in Singapore after joining the Arctic Council as observer? And what can we expect from Singapore in the Arctic Council in the years to come? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me address the first questions. Actually, Singapore is a very, very small country. You can virtually tour the whole of Singapore within 1 or 2 days, and you will be able to cover almost every corner. So we're just like a little David, where we will try to do whatever we can, but I don't think we will be able to do beyond our means. So that's why in my presentation, I only identify 4 areas which we think we will be able to share our knowledge and also make some contributions to the development of the Arctic regions. And for human capital, this is always the most difficult and challenging part, because you can build infrastructure, but how do you motivate people to change, to adapt, to innovate? So this is something that we have been asking ourselves in the last 40 over years in our nation building. This is something that we think after trying, and going through, and not only just trying, but also failing many times, that we have finally discovered that if we give a stake to our citizens and make them see that whatever they do, eventually it will be benefiting them, then I think they will be more, supportive, and then will be more enthusiastic to come forward and to work, not just with the NGOs, but also with the governments. And there's one question about what is the political agenda for joining the Arctic Council. Actually, we don't have a political agenda. Our agenda is mainly for survival. because Singapore is a low-lying country, and if the sea level rises by 1 meter, I think we only left with one small little hill that we call Bukit Timah that still stands above the water. The rest of the Singapore will be submerged under the water. And I wouldn't be surprised that the Prime Minister will have to one day convene his cabinet meeting in a scuba diving suit. So this is how low we are. And because of this, I think we really have to take a long-term view on how we should mitigate this eventuality, because Arctic melting and seawater rising is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And our scientists predicted that in 50 years' time, the seawater level will at least rise by 0.5 meter. In 100 years' time, it will probably rise by 1 meter. Whether the scientists are right or wrong, we do not know. But we cannot simply take this for granted. So actually 2 years ago, the government of Singapore decided that we want to embark on the massive projects to raise Singapore by 1.2 meters. So that hopefully, if our scientists' predictions are right, and then in 100 years' time, the seawater rise by 1 meter, we still have 0.2 meter as a buffer zone to keep our feet dry. But whether this will happen or not, we have to start now. Because if we don't start now, we will never be able to get there. Because those who have been to Singapore will know that we built so extensively in the whole island that we are literally just living next to the water. So if the water rises up, then it will actually overrun the entire island. So for Singapore to be able to raise by 1.2 meters, we cannot simply just say, well, let's wait for the time to come, then we'll do something about it. We need to do the planning now and start building up Singapore in the next 30 to 40 years, so that when the time comes, we are ready. So in a similar fashion, we thought that it is useful for Singapore to get involved in the Arctic Council early, so that we can share whatever we have in mind in terms of master planning, in terms of infrastructural development, and other software technologies and all that, so that we can share with other countries, so that in the next 20, 30 years, working with scientists, working with NGOs and many other organizations, including the Arctic states, that we might just be able to put in place a comprehensive plan where we will be able to ensure that all the resources are extracted safely, the environment is protected, and then the interests of the indigenous communities are also enhanced. So that will be a dream. And that dream actually starts from this conference. And therefore, I'm really grateful to the presidents for organizing this very meaningful event to get all the best brains and the minds in the world to come together so that we can come out with a global solutions to address something that will have a far-reaching impact and consequences on not just Singapore, but the world as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was a very profound statement, very moving statement. I think we are all Singapore in this respect. And thank you very much for having traveled all the way with your delegation to be here and to share this vision with us. I somehow sensed it was an historic moment in the Arctic when Singapore presents its vision in this way. Let me also say that various people have been thanking me. Let me emphasize it's not me who brought this together. It's a great group of people who worked on this for a number of months or a few years. And all of you who have come along and participated deserve the credit for having brought this together. So I think we've had enough of this diplomatic courtesy of thanking me. We should stop that from now on and just move forward with the discussions and the dialogue. But thanks again to Singapore for having led this session. Thank you very much.